You need to leave. This is HOA hunting property. That's what the woman in the expensive camouflage jacket told me, while 8 armed men stood knee-deep in my private marsh. Duck decoys floated behind them. Portable blinds lined the reeds. 2 ATVs sat beneath a professionally made sign that rolled, "HOA members only." I looked at the sign, then at her. "Who owns this property?" She laughed. Actually laughed. "Not you." Then she pulled out her phone and called the game warden to report me for trespassing. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't touch the sign or ask anyone to hand over a weapon. I simply turned around, walked back toward my old pickup, and opened the folder behind the driver's seat, because there was one thing she didn't know. 3 weeks earlier, I had inherited every acre beneath her boots. All 6,200 of them, the marsh, the timber around it, the road they had driven in on, even the ground beneath those HOA duck blinds when the game warden arrived. She confidently handed him an HOA map and told him Cedar Ridge had legal access. I handed him the deed. But strangely enough, the deed wasn't the document that changed everything. Because just as the warden told the hunters to unload their guns and start packing, one of them looked at the HOA president and asked a question. "So what happens to the $2,000 I paid for this season?" I stopped walking. "What $2,000? Nobody answered at first, and that was when I realized the HOA hadn't simply been hunting on property. It did known they had been selling access to it. 3 weeks earlier, I had been sitting in a lawyer's office staring at a number. I honestly thought had to be a mistake. 6,200 acres, my grandfather had left all of it to me. Not just the old farmhouse where I had spent summers as a kid. Not just the pine woods behind it. The deed covered miles of timber, low pasture, drainage channels, old service roads. And nearly 800 acres of marshland along the eastern boundary. I hadn't expected any of it. Granddad was never the kind of man who talked about how much land was worth. He talked about what land needed. A fence needed fixing. A drainage ditch needed clearing. A wetland needed to be left alone, long enough for the birds to come back. That was how he thought. I spent most of my career doing wetland restoration and habitat work for counties, farmers, and private landowners, and that career started in a way because of him when I was young. Granddad used to drag me through that marsh before sunrise and quiz me on everything: where the water came in, where it drained, which grasses held the bank together, where ducks nested when water levels dropped, where muskrats were cutting into the shoreline. He never treated the marsh like empty ground. It was alive, and if you didn't understand it, you could ruin it surprisingly fast. During the last years of his life, Granddad stopped hunting most of the eastern basin. He wanted it left quiet. No engines, no crowds, no fools shooting at shadows. That was how he put it. So after the estate paperwork cleared, one of the first things I did was drive out there alone. I wasn't looking for trouble. I wanted to check the fences, photograph the old survey markers, look at the water level, and make a list of repairs before winter. The truck I drove was a 12-year-old Ford with a cracked dashboard and enough dried mud on the wheel wells to make most people assume I worked for whoever actually owned the place. That assumption would become important later. I turned off the county road a little after 7 in the morning and followed the old gravel lane toward the marsh, about half a mile in. I noticed fresh tire tracks, wide ones, ATV tread, then another set, and another. Granddad never allowed recreational vehicles back there. I stopped the truck. At first I thought maybe a utility crew had come through after the estate transferred. Then I saw 3 shotgun shells beside the road. Fresh 12-gauge, clean brass. 100 yards farther down, someone had trimmed branches away from the road and dumped fresh gravel over a muddy section. That wasn't accidental trespassing. Someone had been maintaining access. I kept driving. Then I came around a bend and hit the brakes, bolted to a cedar post. My grandfather had planted himself was a brand new green and gold sign. It looked professionally made. At the top was the logo of a subdivision I vaguely recognized from several miles west of the property. Underneath it were the words, HOA members only. Designated marsh hunting access. I sat there with the engine running and read it twice. Then a third time. The strange part wasn't that someone had crossed onto my land. People make mistakes. Property lines can be confusing. The strange part was that somebody had crossed onto my land long enough to put up rules. I took out my phone and photographed the sign. Then I looked beyond it toward the marsh. In the distance, I heard shotgun fire, 2 shots a pause, then 3 more. That was when I knew the sign was a mistake. Someone had turned my grandfather Al's Marsh into their hunting club. I parked beside the sign and followed the old service trail on foot. The farther I went, the worse it got. About 200 yards in, I found the first duck blind. It was in a pile of reeds somebody had thrown together for one morning. It was framed with treated lumber, wrapped in camouflage netting, and anchored into the mud with steel posts. A small plastic plaque had been screwed to the front, Station 4, that stopped me. People who wander onto private property by accident unnumber their blinds. I photographed everything, the blind, the trail, the steel posts, then the old property marker 20 feet behind it. With my grandfather S. initials still stamped into the faded orange cap. Another 100 yards farther in, I found Station 5, then Station 6. Beside one of them were 2 tubs filled with decoys and a waterproof storage box marked with the HOA logo. I didn't open anything. I didn't move anything. Years of restoration work had taught me a simple rule. If there may be a dispute later, don't to give anyone a reason to say you disturbed the evidence. So I kept taking pictures. Time, location, condition. By the time I reached the main pool, I could hear voices. 8 men were spread across 3 blinds along the northern bank. 2 were standing in the reeds retrieving birds. Another was loading equipment into a side-by-side ATV. Nobody looked lost. Nobody looked nervous. They looked comfortable. One of them saw me first. He raised a hand. "Hey, you can to be back here." I kept walking until I was close enough that nobody had to shout. "I was about to tell you the same thing." He frowned. Another man stepped out of the blind with a shotgun pointed safely toward the ground. This is private HOA hunting property. Which HOA? Cedar Ridge Estates. Now I recognize the name. A few years earlier, a developer had built nearly 200 homes west of my grandfather's property. Stone entrance columns, artificial ponds, perfect lawns, the kind of neighborhood that advertised natural living. After cutting down most of the natural part, I looked around at the blinds. "How long have you been hunting here?" The first man shrugged. "Years." That answer hit me harder than I expected. "Who gave you permission?" "The association." "Who in the association?" He gave me the kind of look people use when they think the question itself is ridiculous. The board. One of the older hunters reached into his vest. "For crying out loud, Dale." "Just show him the permit." He handed me a laminated card. Across the top was the Cedar Ridge logo. Underneath it, 2026 Seasonal Marsh Access Permit. Authorized member, Zone B Waterfowl. There was a permit number, an expiration date, and a signature at the bottom. "Diane Mercer, HOA President." I looked at it for a moment, then handed it back. "How much did that cost you?" The man hesitated. "Why? I'm curious." He glanced toward the others. "It is part of the annual recreation package." That was the first answer that made me think this might be bigger than a handful of hunters crossing the wrong property line. Before I could ask another question, a younger man stepped out from behind the blind. "You with the county?" "No, then, who are you?" "I am the owner." A couple of them laughed, not loudly. "Just enough." The older hunter shook his head. "No, you are not. What makes you so sure?" "Because the HOA owns the marsh access." "That isn't what I asked." He pointed back toward the service road. "There are signs everywhere. If you not a member, you trespassing." For a few seconds, nobody spoke. I could hear water moving through the cattails behind them. Then the younger man pulled out his phone. "I am calling Diane." "Go ahead." He stepped away to make the call. I stayed where I was. I didn't ask anyone to surrender a weapon. I didn't block an ATV. I didn't threaten anybody. I photographed the permit number and waited. About 15 minutes later, I heard tires coming fast down the service road. A white luxury Saab rolled into view and stopped near the first blind. The woman who stepped out wore spotless knee-high hunting boots, an expensive green jacket, and sunglasses that probably cost more than my first shotgun. Under one arm, she carried a thick black binder. Before she even reached me, she called out, "Are you the man harassing my residents?" I looked at the binder, then at her. "No." She stopped a few feet away. "Then why are you on HOA property?" That was the first time Diane Mercer called me a trespasser. It wouldn't be the last. She didn't introduce herself. She didn't ask my name. She didn't ask why I was there. She walked straight past me, positioned herself between me and the hunters, and opened the binder. "This area is covered by a long-standing HOA access agreement," she said. "Cedar Ridge has maintained recreational rights here for years." "Recreational rights?" Yes, for hunting? She looked irritated that I had asked for community use. I glanced behind her, shotguns, duck blinds, ATVs, stacks of decoys. That looks pretty specific. She closed the binder halfway. Who exactly are you? I already told them. I own the land. Her eyes moved from my muddy boots to my old work jacket. Then she smiled, not because she believed me, because she thought she had figured me out. Sir, people see undeveloped property and assume nobody owns it. That doesn't give you the right to walk into a managed community area and confront residents. I almost laughed. Instead, I asked one question. Can you show me the document that says Cedar Ridge owns this marsh? Her smile tightened. We don't need to own it. Then show me the document that says you can hunt it. She opened the binder again. Inside were maps, HOA policies, maintenance schedules, and what appeared to be an old plat drawing. She tapped a highlighted strip there. Community access easement. I leaned closer without touching the page. It was a photocopy of an old property map. A narrow strip ran from the subdivision toward the marsh. The strip looked familiar. Very familiar. I had seen it before. But Diane was already talking again. This access has existed longer than you've probably been coming out here. Cedar Ridge maintains the road, manages the hunting stations. Controls scheduling and pays for upkeep. That explained the gravel, the trimmed branches, the numbered blinds. They hadn't simply crossed a boundary. They had spent enough time doing it that they had convinced themselves maintenance meant ownership. I looked at the highlighted strip again. Do you have the actual easement language? This is sufficient, no. This is a map. Her voice sharpened. You need to leave. I'm not leaving. One of the hunters shifted behind her. Diane pulled out her phone. Then I'll have enforcement remove you. Please do. That caught her off guard, just for a second. Then she dialed. I listened while she described me as an aggressive trespasser, interfering with a lawful HOA hunt. She said I had entered a restricted recreational area, she said. Residents felt threatened. Then she told whoever was on the other end that Cedar Ridge had documented legal access. I didn't interrupt. I stood there with my hands in my jacket pockets and let her keep talking. When she hung up, she looked satisfied. The game warden is on the way. Good. Her expression changed, only slightly but enough. People who are bluffing usually expect you to be afraid of the person coming to inspect the paperwork. I was T. The paperwork was sitting in my truck and I already knew exactly what that highlighted strip on her map was supposed to mean. The game warden arrived about 20 minutes later. By then, Diane had positioned everyone behind her like she was about to give a press conference. The hunters stood near the blinds. 2 ATVs were parked beside the reeds. Diane had her binder open before the warden even stepped away from his truck. She got to him first. Of course she did. Officer, thank you for coming. This man entered our designated hunting area, confronted our residents, and refused to leave. The warden looked at me. Then at the firearms, then at the HOA signs. Anybody threaten anybody? No, I said. Diane cut in. He was aggressive. The warden looked at me again. Were you aggressive? I asked. Who gave them permission to hunt here? That is, Ed, what? I asked. No, I didn't threaten anyone. He nodded, then looked at Diane. You said this is HOA property? We have legal rights to use it. That wasn't the question either. For the first time that morning, Diane hesitated. We have a recorded access easement. The warden turned toward me. Sir, what is your claim to the property? My truck is about half a mile back. Diane gave a small laugh. You don't have to entertain this. We have maps. The warden ignored her. Go get whatever documentation you have. So I did. I walked back to the Ford, opened the rear door, and pulled out the estate folder. Inside was the certified deed, the same one the attorney had handed me 3 weeks earlier. When I returned, nobody was laughing anymore. I unfolded the document across the hood of the warden's truck. He read the legal description, then the parcel numbers, then the acreage. He used his phone to compare the information with the county parcel map. I watched his eyes move across the screen. North boundary, eastern basin, Marsh, service road. Then he looked at me. How much land did you say you inherited? 6,200 acres. One of the hunters muttered something under his breath. The warden looked at the screen again. This entire marsh is inside your parcel. Yes, and the road they used to enter? Mine too. Diane stepped closer. That does to change our easement. The warden turned to her. So the HOA doesn't own the marsh. We never claimed fee ownership. I looked at her. You called me a trespasser. She ignored me. Our recorded easement gives Cedar Ridge access to this area. The warden glanced at the map she had brought, then at me. You know anything about that? I do, Diane folded her arms. There you go. I closed the deed and reached into the folder again. This time I pulled out a second document, older paper, faded county stamp, my grandfather's signature at the bottom. The HOA does have an easement. Diane smiled for about 2 seconds. Then I opened the document to page 2, but it doesn't say what she thinks it says. The warden took the easement and began reading. Diane stood beside him, arms still folded at first. She looked confident. The document was real, that was the problem. It simply was to the document she had been pretending it was. The easement had been recorded 23 years earlier, when Cedar Ridge was still being developed. My grandfather had given the original developer limited access across a narrow strip along the western edge of his land, not ownership. Not recreation, not hunting access, and the reason was written in plain language. The developer needed to inspect and maintain a drainage channel that carried stormwater away from the subdivision. The warden reached the second page. Then he slowed down. I knew exactly what he was reading. He read the sentence aloud. Access granted solely for inspection, clearing, repair, and maintenance of the designated drainage corridor. Then he looked at Diane. Where does it authorize hunting? She did answer. Instead, she pointed toward her map. The marsh is connected to the corridor. That is what this says. We've maintained this area for years. That still is what this says. Her voice tightened. We have historical use. He flipped another page. No recreational rights. Silence. No hunting rights. One of the hunters looked down at the permit hanging from his vest. The warden continued reading. No right to install structures outside the drainage corridor. He glanced toward the nearest duck blind. Who built those? Nobody answered. Then Diane said, The association maintains them. I almost smiled, not because it was funny, because she had just admitted it. The warden looked at me. Did you authorize any of this? No. Did the previous owner? Not that I'm aware of. I pointed toward another paragraph near the bottom. There he read it. Any use beyond maintenance required written consent from the property owner. The warden turned toward the hunters. Anybody here have written permission from him? Nobody moved. From the previous owner? Nothing, one man finally said. We were told the permit covered it. The warden held out his hand. Let me see that. The hunter passed him the laminated card. Then another hunter handed his over, then another. Every card carried the Cedar Ridge logo. Every card listed the marsh as an HOA-controlled hunting zone, and every card carried Diane Mercer's signature. The warden looked at her. You issued these? The association did. You signed them. As president, he took a breath. Then he told the hunters the hunt was over until the access issue was resolved. Unload the firearms, pack the decoys, remove the ATVs, leave the property. The mood changed instantly. Men who had laughed at me half an hour earlier were suddenly looking at each other. Diane began protesting about established use and resident expectations. The warden cut her off. Ma'am, your easement does to say what you told me it said. That was the first real collapse. But it wasn't the part that changed the entire story. As the hunters started carrying their equipment toward the road, one of the older men stopped beside Diane. He looked angry. Not at me, at her. So what happens to the money? Diane froze. I turned around. What money? The man looked at me. The hunting fee. How much? $2,000. For what? He held up the permit. For the season. Another hunter spoke from behind him. I paid $1,800. Then someone else said mine was $2,200 with guest access. Nobody moved. I looked at Diane. She wasn't talking anymore. That was when I realized Cedar Ridge hadn't just been using my marsh. They had been selling access to it. I stayed after the hunters began leaving. Not because I wanted another argument, because now I needed records. The game warden was still beside his truck when I asked the older hunter whether I could photograph his permit. He looked at Diane, then at me. Go ahead. The card was simple. Cedar Ridge logo, season dates, zone designation, guest privileges, and at the bottom, annual wetlands recreation fee $2,000. That wording caught my attention. Not hunting fee, not private lease, wetlands recreation fee. Broad enough to sound harmless if someone saw it buried in an HOA budget. I photographed both sides. Another hunter handed me his card. $1,800. Another had paid $2,200 because his permit included 2 guest weekends. One man pulled up an email receipt. The subject line read, Cedar Ridge Premium Marsh Access Payment Confirmed. I photographed that too. Diane finally stepped between us. You don't have permission to collect private association documents. The warden looked at her. They voluntarily showing him their own receipts. She turned toward the hunters. You don't need to participate in this. That was when one of them snapped. You told us this was legal. Diane's face hardened. It is legal, no, I said quietly. It is? She looked at me. You don't know how this association operates. I know how property ownership operates. That ended the conversation for a moment. The hunters continued packing, but now they were talking among themselves. How long had the program existed? Who had started it? Where did the money go? One man said he had renewed for 3 years. Another said his neighbor had bought guest access for business clients. A third mentioned an opening weekend lottery that cost extra. I took a small field notebook from my truck and began writing. Not accusations, facts, permit number, amount paid. Year issued, who signed it, what the buyer had been told. The warden noticed. You always do that? Old work habit. Years of habitat restoration had taught me that once records are organized. The loudest argument in the room usually stops mattering. Diane could call it a misunderstanding. She could claim the easement was confusing. She could say someone had interpreted an old map incorrectly. But misunderstandings don't usually come with numbered permits, tiered pricing, guest packages, annual renewals, and professionally printed brochures. Before leaving, one of the hunters walked back toward me. He held out his phone. You should see this. On the screen was a glossy PDF, Cedar Ridge Fall Waterfowl Experience. Below the title was an aerial photograph of my marsh. Arrows pointed toward blinds. Parking areas, access lanes. One section had even been labeled, Premium North Pool. Then I read the sentence at the bottom. All access managed exclusively by Cedar Ridge HOA. I saved a copy. Diane watched me do it. For the first time that morning, she wasn't trying to explain anything. She was simply watching the evidence pile up. I knew what I needed to do. Next, go home. Open every record I could find and start a file. By noon, the marsh was quiet again. The blinds were still there, the signs were still there, but the hunters were gone. I drove home. Made coffee, and spread everything across the kitchen table, the deed, the easement, photographs of the blinds, permit numbers, receipts, the brochure. Then I opened my laptop and started looking for dates. I wasn't searching for some dramatic conspiracy. I wanted to know whether Cedar Ridge had misunderstood the easement once, or whether somebody had kept making the same mistake after being told to stop. Around 4 that afternoon, my phone started buzzing. One of the hunters had given another resident my number. Then another resident contacted me. By evening, I had screenshots of several Cedar Ridge emails. The first came from Diane. The subject line read, Important update regarding marsh access. She called what had happened that morning a temporary boundary dispute. She told residents Cedar Ridge had exercised recreational access for years under a historic easement. Then she said an outside claimant had challenged the association's interpretation. Outside claimant, that was me, the man holding the deed. She finished by saying the board remained confident in Cedar Ridge long-standing rights. I saved the email the following morning. She sent another. This time she described me as a hostile neighboring landowner. I saved that one too. I didn't reply. I didn't post online. I didn't call her. I let her keep talking. Then I found something better than another argument. Buried among my grandfather's property records was a certified letter dated 11 years earlier. He had sent it to Cedar Ridge's management company after discovering ATV tracks near the drainage corridor. The letter acknowledged the maintenance easement. Then it said, no recreational. Hunting, fishing, vehicle, guest, or member access is authorized beyond the limited drainage maintenance rights described in the recorded agreement. At the bottom was proof of delivery. Someone at Cedar Ridge had signed for it. That mattered. But it didn't prove Diane personally knew, so I kept digging. A Cedar Ridge resident who had begun questioning the hunting program helped me obtain old meeting minutes. And there it was, 8 years earlier, agenda item. Marsh access clarification. The minutes said the board had reviewed correspondence from the adjacent landowner concerning limits on recreational access. And listed among the board members attending that meeting was the vice president. Diane Mercer. I read the line twice, then I printed it. The deed proved the land was mine. The easement proved Cedar Ridge had no hunting rights. But the meeting minutes proved something else. Diane already knew there was a problem. She hadn't inherited an innocent misunderstanding. She had inherited a warning and kept selling permits anyway. 2 days later, Cedar Ridge announced an emergency board meeting. Residents were invited. So was I. Diane apparently thought she was going to explain away a property dispute. I walked in carrying a file box thick enough to end one. The community room was full before I arrived. Hunters sat along one wall. Residents filled the folding chairs. 3 board members sat behind a table at the front with Diane in the middle. She had the same black binder she had carried into the marsh. I had a cardboard box. For some reason, that seemed to bother her. Diane opened the meeting by calling the situation a property boundary misunderstanding. Then she spent several minutes talking about Cedar Ridge's history of responsible land stewardship, community access, historic use, resident expectations, good faith interpretation. At one point, she even described the hunting program as a conservation partnership. I let her finish. Finally, she looked at me. "You've challenged the association's rights. You may respond." I stood up and placed one document on the table, the deed, 6,200 acres, no speech, no accusation, just the deed. Then I put the survey beside it. The marsh sits inside these boundaries. One of the board members leaned forward. Diane said, "Again, ownership is not the dispute. We have easement rights." So I handed them the easement. Page 2 was already marked. The treasurer read the clause silently, then read it again. His expression changed. "Drainage maintenance?" Diane cut in. "That language has historically been interpreted more broadly." I placed my grandfather's certified letter on the table. 11 years ago, he told Cedar Ridge exactly how broad it was. Then I added the delivery receipt, and finally the old meeting minutes. Diane's name was sitting there in black and white. Vice President, Marsh access clarification. The room became very quiet. A resident in the second row spoke first, so the board knew. Diane answered immediately, "That is not what those minutes establish." I reached into the box again. This time I pulled out one of the laminated hunting permits, then another, then the brochure Cedar Ridge Fall Waterfowl Experience, Premium North Pool, guest access. Annual fee, Diana's signature. I placed them side by side. You didn't just allow people onto my property. Nobody moved. You sold access to it that landed differently. One of the hunters stood up. "I paid $2,200, another called out. $1,800 last year, $2,000 this year." Someone farther back asked the question. Everyone was starting to think. Where did the money go?" Diane raised her voice. "The fees supported maintenance and conservation." The treasurer turned toward her. "What account?" She looked at him. He repeated the question. "What account, Diane?" That was the moment the meeting stopped being about me. Residents were no longer looking at the stranger in muddy boots. They were looking at their own president. The treasurer opened his laptop. "I don't see a hunting access line item." Diane said the revenue had been categorized under recreation. "How much?" No answer. "How much, Diane?" A hunter held up his phone. "I have receipts going back 3 years." Another resident said his brother had purchased guest weekends. Then somebody mentioned a corporate hunt. Questions started coming from every direction. I stepped back. There was nothing left for me to argue. The deed answered who owned the land. The easement answered who could legally use it. My grandfather's letter answered whether Cedar Ridge had been warned. And the permits answered who had continued selling access anyway. Diane made one last attempt. "This is being taken completely out of context." The treasurer looked at the documents spread across the table. Then at her. "I think the context is sitting right in front of us." For the first time since I had met Diane Mercer, she had nothing to say. The meeting ended without a normal vote. Instead, the association's attorney instructed the board to preserve every record connected to the Marsh program: emails, receipts, bank statements, permit logs, payment records. Anything related to hunting or recreational access. By the following morning, Cedar Ridge had suspended Diane pending an internal financial review. 3 days later, one of the board members called me. They had found the first number. Over 4 hunting seasons, the association had collected more than $40,000 in marsh access fees. Some of the money appeared under general recreation income. Some had been categorized as maintenance reimbursements, and several payments were still being reconciled because the permit records did not match the totals appearing in the HOA summaries. I didn't speculate about where the money had gone. That was my job. My problem was much simpler. People had been entering my property without permission. So I sent Cedar Ridge formal written notice ending every unauthorized recreational use of the land. The drainage easement stayed exactly where it had always been if the association needed to inspect or maintain the drainage corridor. They could schedule access under the original agreement. Nothing more. No hunting, no ATVs, no guest weekends, no premium North Pool, and no laminated permit with Diane Mercer's signature could change that. The HOA's attorney didn't fight me. There wasn't much to fight. Within 2 weeks, crews hired by Cedar Ridge began removing the duck blinds. Every numbered station came out. The storage boxes disappeared. The HOA signs came down. I let them leave the gravel they had added to the road. I considered that partial compensation for the inconvenience. At the entrance to the marsh, I installed a steel gate. Beside it, I mounted one sign: private property, wildlife conservation area. Access by written permission only, no HOA logo, no threats, no drama, just the truth. About a month later, I went back before sunrise. For the first time since inheriting the property, I walked into the marsh without hearing an ATV engine or seeing a laminated permit hanging from somebody's hunting vest. The water was still. Fog sat low over the cattails. As the sky began turning orange, a flock of mallards dropped into the eastern basin. I stood there longer than I expected. Granddad used to carry an old green thermos on mornings like that. The coffee inside was strong enough to dissolve a spoon. He would sit quietly and watch the birds before deciding whether we were going to hunt at all. Some mornings we never fired a shot. I understand that better now. Owning land does mean squeezing every dollar or every possible use out of it. Sometimes ownership means being the person willing to say no to shortcuts. No to people who confuse access with entitlement. And no to someone who thinks a title on a neighborhood board gives them the right to give away something that belongs to somebody else. Cedar Ridge eventually refunded hunters who had paid for access. The HOA had no authority to sell. The board rewrote its recreational policies. Diane never returned as president. What happened after the financial review was between her, the association, and the people examining those records. I didn't need to see her dragged away in handcuffs. That was never the point. The point was standing beside that marsh and knowing nobody could sell it, rename it, or order me off it again. Diane had called me a trespasser on land my family had protected for generations. She had maps, permits, signs, a binder full of policies. I had one deed, 6,200 acres, and one simple question she should have asked before she sold the very first hunting permit: who actually owns the ground beneath your feet?